Let's start it off here with the Cincinnati Bengals, guys, joined by Fabian Sommer, Hitman, Eric Eager, VP of Sumer Sports. And the Bengals have a lot of hype around them going into this year, and for good reason. One win away from the Super Bowl a year ago would have been a back-to-back Super Bowl run for them. They went 12-4. They demolished Buffalo in the AFC Championship as well before eventually losing to Cincinnati, to Kansas City. But this is a team that has high expectations in a very tough division. Is it Super Bowl or bust for the Cincinnati Bengals this year? I'll start with you, Eric. And how close do you think they are to actually being able to finally get over that hump?
In a weird way, I think it kind of is Super Bowl or bust, just because the way in which they constructed their team is not going to work in the future. So, I always read these names off, but going into 2021, it was Trey Waynes, Eli Apple, Chidobe Awuzie, Mike Hilton, Von Bell, Trey Flowers, Ricardo Allen. They built all their weak link systems with veterans who were not that highly paid for veterans, but would be more expensive and more high variance than the rookies that they're going to have to build those same systems with after, Chase, Higgins, and Burrow make what will amount to be probably $110 million per year out of the 250, let's say, by the time the cap it's really realized. So they're going to be making more than 40% of the cap for three players. It's just such a much more difficult existence that way. So while they're still in that window, I think that they have to at least win one for them to be satisfied about the results of this first run of the Joe Burrow career.
Hitman, I look at Cincinnati in the division right now, plus 121 to win the division at Pinnacle. I'm curious where you think they stack up against the other elite teams in the AFC. Because if we go back to last year, if you remember back to mid-season last year, everyone was kind of down on Kansas City in the early going, up on Buffalo. Then as the year went on, those things started to evolve. But Cincinnati's kind of been consistently in that mix. Where do you power rate them on the tier with the other top teams in the AFC with Kansas City and Buffalo? Are they on that level, or are they a step behind?
I have them below Kansas City, and then by maybe a point and a half, I have them behind, right with Buffalo. And then there's a little bit of a teardrop when you go from Cincinnati and Buffalo to the next teams. And what I'll say with Cincinnati is I like, obviously, the signing now that they finally got a left tackle and they can move Jonah Williams to right tackle. Obviously, the concern with them is they lost some players in their secondary, but they have a great defensive coordinator that I think maybe early in the season, it takes a little bit of a learning curve with the new players in the secondary, but they get it going towards the back half of the year. And one thing I'll say about them is this team has had Kansas City's number. I mean, they could have they beat them obviously twice the season before, and last season they beat them in the regular season, and that was a result that I think at some points towards the end of the game in live wagering, Cincinnati was like minus 170 or something late in that game to beat them. And then you look at them against Buffalo before the game had to be stopped due to the Damar Hamlin situation. Cincinnati was a 3-point dog in that game, and they were, I think, minus 200 in live wagering when it was stopped going up and down the field. And then they played them in the playoff game, and as 6-point dogs without their offensive linemen, they handled them. So I think that this team, they do match up pretty well against Kansas City and Buffalo. But then just going back to your earlier question, Super Bowl or bust, it's hard to have that mentality in the AFC because there's just so many teams that you could realistically see making the Super Bowl.
It is a pretty loaded conference, Suma, and I want to get your thoughts on the Bengals because in years past, I think maybe the Bengals weren't deep enough to sustain like a major injury or anything like that, especially on defense. They had some turnover this offseason, especially at safety, losing both starting safeties as well. What are your thoughts on the Bengals going into this year? I think they're a little bit deeper. I mean, I think they have close to an elite quarterback, but did they have anything that they benefited from last year that potentially made them look better than they were?
I think what they benefited from the past 2 years was they won the division and benefited from opposing quarterback play within the division not being really good. So the Ravens missed Lamar Jackson for like 4 or 5 games each year. Cleveland had that Baker Mayfield mess in 2021. Then last year, Deshaun Watson was suspended for 12 weeks, and did not play up to his usual standard when he came onto the field. And Pittsburgh was dealing with the last straw of Ben Roethlisberger, and then last year they had Kenny Pickett as a rookie. And everything changes this year, in my opinion. Like Cleveland are getting a full season with Deshaun Watson in what's going to be a new kind of scheme with decent playmakers. The Ravens have a whole new receiving group with Todd Monken, and Kenny Pickett is entering year two with a stable offensive line, so to speak. So I think this is something that might be harming to the Bengals within their division. And also what you just said, losing both starting safeties, losing Eli Apple. Eli Apple was not really good, but they're basically losing the three players with the three most snaps on defense last year. And as high as I am on Lou Anarumo, I would expect some damage at least early in the season, and I think these are the two most glaring points for me to think that the Bengals, even though I'm also high on them in general, might have a tougher road towards a home playoff game this year.